Hey, Jack. Good to see you. Thanks for
Hey,
joining.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
This is a spicy topic, and I think I'm very glad that we have a European and an American on this episode because I think we bring very different perspectives and probably cultural norms to this topic. And no better person to talk about than you. So, a lot of different angles that I want to get into, but maybe let's start really big picture. I also saw your blog today that you released, which is exactly probably where to start. Um, how much oil are we going to keep burning in the future?
Yeah, well, I think that is a good place to start. It's what I think about a lot. By way of folks listening, my name is Jack Andreasen-Cavanaugh. I work at the Center on Global Energy Policy. I run the carbon management program. I used to work at Breakthrough Energy on carbon management policy. I used to work at Duke Energy, the utility in the Southeast. And my background is in CO2 storage, both regulatory and policy, and a little bit on the technical side. Though I'm not a geologist or an engineer, and would never claim to be one. Um, so yeah, I think my interest in this space and broadly what I work on is, I think generally speaking, a lot of folks in climate uh, look at emissions from the lens of what are all these different technologies that are going to supplant the need for oil and gas in the future, which makes perfect sense. And in that regard, we have a lot of good alternatives already, especially in the power sector with renewables and batteries, which are, at least in the United
Hmm.
States, by and large being deployed at much faster scales than any fossil alternatives. Coal is sort of hanging on at the moment, not really because of necessarily totally because of market forces, but is going to decrease over time, namely because it's more expensive. And then with the transport sector, right, EVs are rapidly being deployed around the world, maybe less so in the United States, more of a political issue there than a technology one. Um, but then as you look and you get through power sector and you get through the transport sector, which is to say those are around 2/3 of global emissions, you start to get into industry, um, and the roadmap to decarbonization becomes much less clear. And yes, you've got things like hydrogen and direct reduced iron for steel making, and you've got things like companies like Brimstone Energy and Sublime Systems for cement, um, thermal batteries. If I didn't mention that, but you look at these, and at the end of the day, um, they're a long ways off, decades off from commercialization and at the scale of producing their particular product at the scale that is demanded today and projecting future demand growths. And so 1/3 of emissions in the industrial sector are really challenging to decarbonize. Now, to be clear, when you look at all those technologies, thermal batteries or Sublime or Brimstone or hydrogen production to some extent, um, they all rely on essentially the same thing, which is cheap, abundant, low-cost power and heat. So if you're going to decarbonize anything in the industrial sector or broadly in the economy, you need really cheap heat and power in order to be able to do that. Uh, and so pointedly to your question about how much oil are we going to burn in the future, I think that's actually a really interesting way to phrase it. Because one, just from a pick your favorite modeling group, whether it's IEA
Hmm.
or Shell or you look at IPCC drawdowns, uh, you know, the latest Shell transition energy security report, I believe they called it, in 2070 had 34 million barrels a day of oil production.
How much is
IEA's
that
net
compared to
zero,
today? Just to get a
yeah, we're
reference.
we're over 100 million a day.
So roughly a third. Still in
Yeah,
2070.
yeah, 2070. It could be 2050. I would have to double check, but even, I mean, 2050, that's
Yeah.
a rapid decline as well. But even in IEA's net zero, um, by 2050, it's 24 million barrels a day. And that is a lot. That is, a
That's a
fourth, maybe a
lot.
little. Yeah, that's a lot of barrels of oil.
Do
And
you know the
largely then
emissions
when
of
you,
that by any chance? Like how much
I
emission
don't
that
off the
would
top of
be?
my head. And this is the important piece about you said, how long we're going to burn barrels of oil. And when you look at like where those barrels of oil are actually going in terms of like where they're being used,
Yeah.
the number one area is petrochems. chemicals, plastics, and the emissions associated with oil there are much lower because oil is an input into processes and is not necessarily combusted. And so you have the emissions of the extraction and the transportation of oil, but you don't have the combustion. Now, there are other industries
Interesting.
like aviation, like long haul shipping, that would combust things like bunker fuel or jet fuel for transportation. And those emissions, albeit still significant, are much lower. And I think that you've already seen a recognition in the oil and gas industry that is the future of oil is non-combustible. Darren Woods, the CEO of Exxon, said this publicly. He said something to the tune of, when you look at oil in the future, I don't think we'll be combusting much of it. I think it'll be an input into processes. So the oil industry has grappled with this, and they see the future sort of moat and fortress of oil demand in non-combustible commodities.
Interesting. But so because I'm much closer to aviation and petrochemicals, for example, so I hear a lot about, yeah, just the challenges that aviation is facing. But you're saying that even in that scenario, aviation would be a small fraction of the residual use of oil compared to petrochemicals, for example?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Relatively, I don't have the exact percentages off the top of my head, but it's going to be lower than petrochems.
Interesting. So when we say phase out of fossil fuels, that's a weird way to put it then, right? Because we're not phasing out fossil fuels, we're reducing them and hopefully lowering the emission footprint of them. Or how do you
Yeah,
see that part?
I mean, realistically, like it all depends on the time scale. Like, could I imagine a world in 20, you know, 150 years from now in which the oil demand is like 1 million barrels a day or non-existent? Like, that could happen. I even find that kind of difficult to believe. Um, but yeah, I mean, in the near term, like I said, net zero scenarios have 25, 24 million barrels of oil a day in it. And so really what you're doing is, yeah, it is a phase out to some extent, but not a phase out to zero, at least. And the timescale to get to zero is much longer than 2050 or 2070. And I think another interest of mine in this is there are not just climate considerations about what the world looks like in a net zero society and who is producing the oil and where it's going, but there are serious geopolitical, domestic security,
For sure.
community level implications around, in a future of 24 million barrels of oil a day, which countries are producing it, which countries are demanding it, what is the price, um, what are the geopolitical, what is the geopolitical map in terms of who is producing and who is using it, how does that influence greater geopolitical discussions? And so a lot of my interest in the oil and gas sector is, one, finding ways to reduce emissions from it as much as possible and develop cost competitive alternatives. But two, understanding that the reason that we use oil and gas is not largely because there's some, global conspiracy that, is inducing demand for oil and gas. It's because oil and gas make incredibly affordable products that are demanded by people across the world. And we've been using oil and gas for 100+ years, and it's incredibly useful and intertwined into international trade, geopolitics, and domestic
Everything.
economies. And so it's,
Yeah.
yeah, it is. And that is my sort of why I work on oil and gas, is I think, like, if you care about emissions, my first thought is like, well, I should go to where the emissions are. And
Yeah.
that's in the oil and gas sector.
Super interesting. And I know obviously we have a very much a carbon perspective today, but there, as you mentioned, there's a lot of other ones. I would also say pollution, plastic pollution. I mean, there's so many other variables to this, but we're not going to go too much into that today. First off, I want to thank everyone who's joining. Also see the first comments coming in, so keep them coming. We'll rope them into the discussion. So let's move next. Now that we've got kind of the big picture of where fossil fuel is heading, explain to me, is a barrel a barrel? What are the differences when we come at this from a climate perspective between different types of oil?
Yeah, totally. So there's like the standard grading of oil, which is, you can imagine, a very heavy, sour crude, something that's produced in Venezuela or Canada, which are not entirely the exact same, right? Heaviness is graded on a scale called API. It's basically the specific gravity that the barrel of oil contains, and sour is the sort of amount of sulfates that are present in the oil. And then you have everything down like light sweet crudes, which are much lighter and much less sour. Now there are those grading scales, and that is important for refining because the heavier and sour the oil, the more refining that needs to be done to some extent to produce things like diesel or heavy fuels for shipping. Or, you have necessarily less refining or a different type of refining that needs to take place for something like a light sweet crude to go into gasoline, or as a chemical feedstock into a process like petrochemicals. So historically, we already have grading that goes on.
Does that
And
also
right, these are
relate?
all,
Sorry, does that correlate with how dirty they are? This grading, how
yeah,
heavier, dirtier, because you need more
well,
refining, or not?
yeah, well, I think that gets into like, what does dirty mean? And if we're just taking a carbon um, perspective on this, uh, the lion's share of the carbon emissions of a barrel of oil come from the production, transportation, and then obviously the burning of the barrel of oil. So you can sort of partition where all the emissions from extraction of oil come to the future combustion or usage of that oil into a process. Certainly the emissions associated with refining would be included in that, and you have a heavier refining process for something like a heavy sour crude. That doesn't necessarily always correlate to more or less emissions. It matters like what you're refining it into. There could be more or less refining done based off of the final product that you need.
Hmm.
And so what I think about is like, uh, not all barrels are treated the same. It depends on where you produce them. What are the environmental regulations in place? How did you produce it? And so you can look at a bunch of different ways to decrease the full life cycle carbon intensity of a barrel of oil. The first place is the extraction. So and literally from not just the extraction itself, pulling the oil out of the ground, but where you look for the oil, how much drilling you need to do to actually get the oil out of the ground, right? There's a lot of exploration that goes on. If you drill less wells, because when you drill wells, you're using mechanical equipment that emits carbon, and you have to buy equipment that emits carbon in the manufacturing of those. If you drill fewer wells, if you drill better wells, um, and you access larger resources, um, and easier to extract resources, you limit the amount of emissions from the sort of exploration and first production. The next place you would go is the continued drilling operations, and that you can reduce emissions quite a bit by electrification of the oil patch. So these are the
I saw
actual
that, yeah.
machines that are doing the extraction and transportation, having electrical components rather than being powered by diesel generators or something like that. And that is a really interesting place because in the United States, it may surprise some. The oil and gas industry is the second largest purchaser of renewable energy, second to the tech industry. And by and large, they don't do it because they care about the fact that they're saving emissions. That's a nice co-benefit, but they do it because it's cheaper, because renewable energy is cheaper. Um, the next place is transportation of the oil and gas, right? Like there's, especially with gas, you have upstream methane leakages, but with a lot of oil production, you also have gas production. That's called associated gas. Um, and so there's all sorts of things. You can replace pneumatic controllers in pipelines. A recent example of this is EQT, which is one of the largest natural gas companies in the United States. Last year, I believe the number was they replaced 9,000 pneumatic controllers in their pipeline network, and that saved the CO2 equivalent of 350,000 tons from hitting the atmosphere. Um, Now that's good from an emissions perspective, but again, EQT did it they care. They're one of the lowest CI producers of natural gas in the United States, and they have a long history of committing to that. But primarily they did it because they have more natural gas to sell in the system. So there's this sort of a little bit of I don't know if everyone would call it a virtuous cycle, but there's a business motivation to do something on this. So you have exploration emissions, you have production emissions, you have transportation emissions, and then finally, it's where you use it, right, or what the oil is necessarily used in. One final piece on the production is it's related to usage. is we have a lot of natural gas power plants being built in the United States. One way to decrease the CO2 emissions from a natural gas power plant is to put carbon capture equipment on the plant, capture 90 to 95% of those emissions. You can then take that CO2 and you can put it back underground for a process called enhanced oil recovery, which I wrote about today. And basically, that CO2 in a lot of oil reservoirs, you get anywhere from sort of like 30 to 70% of the oil out of the ground with what's called primary extraction. Uh, enhanced oil recovery is a process that is called tertiary extraction. And you take CO2, there are other chemical constituents that you can send underground. People are looking at foams and all sorts of different things. But if you send CO2 underground, you increase oil, you get the last anywhere from 70 to 30% of the oil out of the existing reservoir. 50% of the CO2 remains stored in long-term storage underground forever. 50% of that CO2 or so is leaked to the surface through the production well. But if you do enhanced oil recovery, and you have electrified your field, and you are displacing a barrel of oil on the global market that would otherwise be produced through primary extraction, you can have pretty drastic life cycle carbon emission reductions. Now, I would say, just for the sake of being complete, the most controversial portion of that calculation is if you are displacing a barrel of oil in the market, and then which barrel of oil are you displacing? Now, the standard sort of assumption is that you're displacing the marginal producer of oil, which is Saudi Arabia. And so you would be displacing a Saudi Arabian barrel of oil from being on the market by producing an enhanced oil recovery barrel. So enhanced oil recovery is another way to decrease the life cycle emissions of a barrel of oil. Yeah,
Can I
I'll
ask you
stop there.
something
I know
on
that
that?
was a lot.
Because
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
EOR, I definitely want to do a deep dive on EOR in this conversation. Why does it have such a bad reputation? At least coming from Europe, EOR is almost a swear word. So the
Yeah.
way that you put it, it sounds nice, it sounds great, it sounds like a no-brainer. So why does it have a bad rep?
Yeah. Well, I think first off, it's just sort of like it's bundled up into, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation of what enhanced oil recovery is and what it isn't. And I think it's bundled up into, most people view it as, oh, you're just increasing oil production. And we don't want increased oil production. We want decreased oil production. So anything that would increase oil production is an anathema to caring about climate and caring about emissions.
Yeah.
Now, what I would say is that in a world, we have to decrease oil consumption and oil demand. There is no way to reach any climate goals by doing 100 million barrels a day, by doing 50 million barrels a day. Like we have 40 million barrels a day. Like we have to drastically decrease oil demand. And that is, again, through cost competitive alternatives in some sectors. And then you look at others, and carbon capture and sequestration is one valuable technology, especially for the industrial sector. But if you believe that we do need decreased demand and we will decrease demand, I always ask myself, what has to be true? Again, cost competitive alternatives. The second is that there has to be some sort of implicit or explicit carbon pricing at both the nation state level and internationally. And we see that going on, right? Japan has a new ETS, Europe has a longstanding ETS, Canada has an industrial ETS. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is now taking into swing. The United States has two different bills, one by Democrats and one by Republicans, to offer a sort of counterweight to the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the United States. And so if that is all true, then the carbon intensity of products matter. It is baked into the cost of those products now, which it isn't in all geographies today. And so then, in that future, the carbon intensity of a barrel of oil will matter in the global market. And so the fact that enhanced oil recovery can supply, on a life cycle analysis, a lower emission intensity barrel of oil, it will naturally be advantaged in the marketplace. And so not
But
only
there's
do
a
you
big
have
assumption
emissions.
there, Jack, right? Like I wanted to get to kind of CBAMs and so on as well,
Yeah.
but that is future talk, right? And also if we think
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
the US, and a lot of the oil produced in the US is going to also be used domestically, right? So um I'm wondering if I'm just trying to kind of play devil's advocate a bit on the moral hazard side, because that's definitely one of the biggest concerns when people approach this conversation is, right, okay, you can extract more. And when you see how oil and gas executives talk about it, it's very much we can get more oil, we can get all the oil. And so your point is basically that, okay, that's the narrative that they use, but that in practice, we need to work on other areas, like better alternatives, basically. That is the main thing that's going to go hand in hand with cleaner oil.
Yeah. Well, I think when you look at what oil executives say about oil and enhanced oil recovery, I think that I view all of these conversations through the fact that these are publicly traded companies with shareholders, and they have to earn a rate of return and prove that, every quarter in the United States and globally. And, you're not going to get an oil and gas CEO in any public platform saying like, yeah, we want to have the managed decline of our own industry. Like, of course, that's like silly. So like you have to look at like what is actually
Fair.
happening. So to level
Yeah.
set on EOR is currently 2% of global market demand. So it's an incredibly small portion of the oil that's actually going on the market. However, we can craft policies and regulations that incentivize the lowest carbon intensive EOR production possible. And so if we're using oil at all, which we are, regardless of if it's in the future or not, we should want that oil to be as low carbon intensive as possible. And EOR is one amongst other ways that you can make lower carbon intensity oil. And so, that's always my sort of hang up on this. It's like, shouldn't we, as long as we're using it, shouldn't we want low carbon oil and gas? And if it's only 2% of global market, like, what are we really talking about here in terms of um, like a sort of like moral hazard? Like, it's not a big enough sort of like slice of the pie here that it really even matters in the near term. And yet it does have current emission benefits associated with it. And the final things I'll say on EOR, and happy to talk and answer more questions, is there are also a lot of other benefits besides strictly an emissions one. First and foremost, if you're more efficiently using current resources, you then necessarily drill fewer greenfield sites. So you have
Yeah.
to drill less, new production wells if you're maximizing the current efficiency of your existing wells. In the United States, shale oil is slated to plateau and decline as early as 2027. Massive implications for geopolitics and domestic economy. But if that is true, enhanced oil recovery is a way to continue to produce oil from those shale reservoirs that is currently being demanded. This isn't induced demand. This isn't new demand that's coming on the market. If America doesn't do EOR and produce from shale, it'll just be more Saudi oil or more Iraqi oil or more Iranian oil. It's not that this oil demand is magically going to disappear. And so, there are benefits to this outside of the climate one, which I think is so key in the climate world that I am very serious about my efforts on climate change. But when you look across the globe, domestic economy concerns, geopolitical concerns almost always supersede climate
Always.
ones, right? And so if you can find areas where you get geopolitical, domestic economy, and emissions benefits, we should do that. We should do that thing. That is a unique confluence of factors. And the same things exist with renewables, right? You depend less on fuel costs. You depend less on foreign imports of oil and gas. And that's good. And that's a good thing for renewables. And we recognize that with renewables. We don't recognize that with enhanced oil recovery.
Just one thought I have here is almost about oil imperialism clean oil imperialism of the future. Because if I take your scenario and I think about a world where we have CBAMs, where we have carbon baked into products that use oil, and we have dominance by countries like the US, like Norway, on producing that type of oil, what do developing countries do that still rely heavily on oil, that won't be able to produce that domestically? It almost sounds like that could create, a new type of imperialism that really sets back the countries that will probably rely most on oil in the future, which are developing countries. How do you see potentially that dynamic?
Well, one, the best thing we can do for developed countries is make them as energy independent as they can be, help them to become as energy independent they can be, without the need for oil and gas. We should, the United States is great at developing cutting edge technologies like thermal batteries, like, new ways to make cement. And the hope is, and the goal should be to sort of like leapfrog as much of that as you can, right? So in the same way Africa did with cell phones, um, you just sort of obfuscate the need for a lot of fossil fuel build out, and you can just you can have brimstone-esque technologies go in there and produce their cement. Now that's not going to be smooth. That's a sort of pie in the sky vision of this. But I think it's important that a lot of countries produce oil right now. Uh, in the future, there will necessarily be some decrease in the countries that produce oil and gas. Um, and there is no, yeah, I find it very difficult to imagine or conceive of a world in which you don't allow, you put the burden of carbon and carbon emissions on countries that didn't emit them in the first place and aren't the reason that we have wide scale global warming and the sort of climate change that we see today. And so, yeah, that's a tough conversation. I certainly don't have an answer. I'm not a global diffusion geopolitical guy. Um, but I think that, yeah, there is certainly, and I know that there are like phase-ins with CBAM and allowances, I think, or something, but there has to be some sort of like pathway that they can access that isn't going to decrease their quality of life, because that's not going to be accepted. It's not politically uh, possible or salient for people in those countries, and they deserve the quality of life that we all enjoy in the United States and Europe.
Yeah, I see a real risk there, but let's see how this evolves. I did you watch I posted it, right? But did you watch the conversation between Chris Wright and Vicky Holub in Davos? That
Absolutely did.
that was very interesting. As a European, that conversation was like two people from a different planet. It's like conversation that would never ever happen in Europe. And yeah, I mean Chris Wright in particular. I mean some of the things. Anyway, what I wanted to get at were some questions. Like for example, this concept: does net zero barrel of oil exist?
I mean, Oxy sold a options contract a couple of years ago to SK for I think 200,000 barrels of net zero oil. I don't know where those barrels are at, if they've been delivered, if they've been produced.
How do you get
It is
there?
a
Like
physical,
what is that? Can you explain what a
yeah,
net zero barrel of oil is?
totally. It's a physical reality. It's technically possible. Like if it is just it's a physics question. If you look at, the full life cycle analysis of production and combustion or usage of a barrel of oil, that is, X carbon emissions, through things like electrification of the patch, all the things we talked about previously, including some amount of CO2 that is either removed from the air or captured from industrial processes and sent down for permanent sequestration, you can balance those two numbers out. And you could even put more CO2 underground than would have been emitted across the entire supply chain for that barrel of oil. And so, yeah, it is absolutely technically feasible. I understand why people scoff at it, and I understand why people, I think, rightly point out the sort of like greenwashing implications of stuff like that. But that's not to say it's not real and we can't do it. It is a matter of cost. It is not a matter of technical feasibility.
Do you know how much more expensive a net zero barrel of oil today would be than a conventional barrel?
A lot more expensive. I mean, it would matter on it, but it would matter on, what you would have to look at the full life cycle of like, what is, exploration, production, transportation cost? What is the current price of a barrel of oil? What is, are you using CO2 from the atmosphere versus capturing it from an industrial facility? Yeah, I don't have a good sense of if it would be 2 or 3 times more expensive or what it would be. Um, but again, in a low demand future, you would imagine that the price of oil would be higher, and again, embedded carbon emissions are in it. And you could also have private buyers that just want the lowest carbon intensive barrel of oil possible for whatever corporate commitments,
Yeah.
domestic regulatory policy on carbon emissions. And so, do I think net zero and net negative barrels of oil are going to be a massive percentage of global market share? No, I don't. But you have to get really, really close to, as low as you can, as close as you can to zero, um, if we are going to hit a lot of our climate goals, right? Because the more emissions you can, as we've said, and you and I have said in CDR a million times, the more emissions you can just reduce and not hit in the atmosphere, uh, then you don't
Less
have
we
to
have to
remove
suck up.
them. Yeah, which is
And
the most
actually,
expensive part.
that's a really interesting, I think, transition because if we can dive a little bit deeper on the EOR side, one question I have is, we're going to get more into Oxy. They're doing DAC as well for EOR, but why use DAC for EOR if you can just use fossil CO2? Like, why would you in the first place not use the cheaper stuff that's much more widely available?
Yeah. Well, first, Oxy currently isn't using DAC for EOR. They're not doing that. That is largely because the economics don't pencil out at the moment. They could in the future, but right now, Stratos, their big DAC facility, they have over 1 million tons sold on there for CDR credits. And the facility can do up to 500,000 tons a year. So you're like a little over 2 years of dedicated storage capacity that they have. And then maybe after that, if there's a decrease in demand for CDR, they may turn to doing CO2 enhanced oil recovery with direct air capture as a way to lower the cost premium associated with doing DAC, right? That is another valuable thing about EOR is that right now, EOR is expensive to do. It's more expensive than just primary extraction. And so we have the 45Q tax credit in the United States that pays companies either $85 from point source capture or $180 a ton from direct air capture to do enhanced oil recovery. And then enhanced oil recovery gives you a profitable commodity in a barrel of oil that then you can sell. So you increase the project economics of doing it with enhanced oil recovery. And Oxy will do that at some point in the future. They aren't doing it currently, but yeah.
Check a question there because just so I understood that correctly, because you explained how EOR allows you to suck up those extra 50, 70%. But are you saying that as of today, without subsidies, it's cheaper to drill another well in another, do more exploration than to get out the 50, 70% through EOR? Why do you need the
Yeah, yeah.
subsidy, basically? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. It's more expensive to do it. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And so do you think the subsidy, like, is that what it takes to, if we think about how do we scale EOR, assuming that we need more barrels of oil produced that way in the future, do you need more 45Qs elsewhere in the world? Are they the right price point? What are the right policies?
Yeah, well, this is the answer to every carbon management question, which is someone has to pay for it. And so there's all sorts of different mechanisms. You can do 45Q like the United States. You can do ETSs like you do in Europe. You can layer on a CBAM to that. You could do straight government procurement of things like carbon dioxide removal. You have private purchases of, for instance, the first offtake agreement for a natural gas CCS power sector facility in the United States was announced a couple months ago. That's Google. Google is just paying the cost premium of doing CCS. So you take what it costs to do CCS, minus $85 a ton for 45Q. The premium of doing it on top of that, Google is paying for. That's great. I'm not a fan of relying on voluntary demand because it is by definition voluntary. And so, yeah, I mean, it all comes down to the price of carbon. Like, how much are people, whoever those people are, taxpayers, nation states, economic zones, private industry, how much are you willing to pay for a ton of CO2? And that's kind of the whole ballgame.
And this is something that actually I was quite surprised in that, going back to the conversation between Vicky Hollop from Occidental Petroleum, and Chris Wright, the Secretary of Energy. She was using a lot of environmental or climate carbon language. I was almost surprised, like, why would she talk so much about carbon intensity, about CO2, about emissions? And I was quite surprised by that. So, because it doesn't really matter for the American context, as far as I understand. What's your view on that?
Yeah. Well, I am a longtime admirer of of Vicky Hollop and the vision that she set forward at Oxy. I understand, I laid this out in a LinkedIn comment, but I understand why people look at that conversation and garner some like consternation from it. But I think again, like you have to separate, she's at WEF, talking to the secretary of the Department of Energy in the United States. She's an oil CEO talking about the future of the oil industry. And so Vicky's long-term plan, as I see it from truly reading the hard investments that they've made, right? It's easy to talk about things. It's easy to say that, yeah, we're going to do CCS and stuff, but the proof of the pudding is in the tasting. And the private sector, it's how much money, how much capital you're actually deploying on these technologies. And so uh, she is deploying as a publicly traded company who at the beholden of the stock price can decide to keep or get rid of a CEO whenever the shareholders feel like it. Um, she has decided to invest billions of dollars in direct air capture, CCS, pipelines, and CO2 storage. Now, why would she do that? Why? Well, greenwashing, if she really was intending to do that, is so much cheaper than spending billions of capital as
I
a
love that
publicly traded
argument you
company.
made. Yeah.
And so like what is more likely? Is she taking Oxy towards what an oil and gas company needs to look like and how they need to operate in the future? And does she sort of like believe in that? Um, that is how I garner from that, because if she truly was greenwashing and trying to delay the demand for fossil fuels, why wouldn't she just like buy $1 forestry credits and say they're going to do CCS and never invest in it? Like it's so much
Yeah.
easier to fake it than it is to do it. And she is like actually doing it, and takes environmental stewardship incredibly seriously.
Are there other who are for in the US, but if you know, maybe even beyond the US, who are the pioneers of decarbonizing oil and gas?
ExxonMobil is like $15 billion planned for their low carbon ventures group, which includes mostly the production of molecules. They're looking at hydrogen production in Texas. They're looking at petrochems. They're looking at ammonia. They're looking at the sort of heavy industry side of things. 15 billion is an incredible amount of money to put towards decarbonizing heavy industry. And when I say like, to be clear, when I'm talking about who is doing some of the stuff, I just look at like who is actually deploying capital in this space. And so Exxon is certainly one that's deploying capital. I'm going to butcher their name, Italian oil and gas company,
It's
Eni,
not
Eni?
Enel.
And then they've put an incredible amount of money towards their CCS business. In fact, BlackRock just bought 50% of the Global Infrastructure Fund, which is a part of BlackRock, bought 50% of their CCS business, and they're working in the UK right now. Obviously, Equinor
Yeah,
has been
that came up
investing
a lot in
heavily
the
in this over
comments.
time. Yeah, absolutely. Chevron has been investing in this in the United States and abroad, to be fair, to varying degrees of success. When you look at the Gorgon facility in Australia, that has not been a success of a CCS facility. And then on the gas side of things, you look at EQT. Again, I would encourage folks to look at the sort of environmental commitments and low carbon gas that EQT is producing in the United States. It's pretty incredible. And then by just nature of sheer capital accessible, plus the very low carbon intensity emissions profile of their production, the Gulf states have invested some and are investing money into carbon capture and storage and emissions reduction technology. They have the ability to put forward capital here that no one else on the planet does. And when they decide they really are going to turn on the investment jets, it could be really impressive.
Do you feel that you mentioned a lot of examples now. Do you feel that these investments are sufficient for where we are right now? Are they very small compared to what they could do as well? Like how do you stack that up?
Yeah, well, I mean, in carbon management broadly, we're vastly, including CDR, we're vastly underinvesting across every portion of the value chain and every geography in the world. Again, in net zero analyses, CCS and CDR make up something like 25% of total emissions reductions and removals. And right now they get like 1 to 3% of total global investment. And so, no, we're not investing enough. Companies are doing what they can under the current regimes. But again, um, I know folks don't like this. This is very American point of view, but someone has to make money doing this. And there currently is enough money to be made in doing it. And so people aren't deploying capital. When that calculus shifts, whether through regulatory regimes or incentivization and markets, we can deploy the capital to do it. Again, CDR and CCS are not technical challenges, they're cost challenges.
And yeah, in the comments, thank you, Hugo and Christopher. There's a lot of talk of Equinor and also Aramco and what they are doing in the space. And maybe obviously we've touched on carbon removal, but very little. But one thing that I did want to talk about is, do you think the only way for DAC to survive in the US in the coming years is by being basically used for EOR and tying into this story that we've discussed today? How do you see the role of DAC in what we've just basically discussed?
Yeah, well, I mean, public support for DAC, right, is DAC Hub's program is sort of up in the air on if that's actually going to be administered or not. And that's just CapEx, which is very useful, and it's billions of dollars in CapEx. But that's one lifeline. You've got 45Q, which is $180 a ton, which is to say insufficient for total, making the project economics count. You have private demand on top of 45Q. So all the folks that want to buy DAC, they could help keep the DAC afloat for the next couple of years. But it is just true that, like, if you want direct air capture as a technology to survive, the companies doing it have to make money. And right now, the ways to do that in the United States are 45Q, government grants, regulatory regimes like low carbon fuel standards, and then using enhanced oil recovery. So we want this technology. We're going to need it to some extent in the long run. I have no conniptions, and in fact, I think it's perfectly fine, um, and in fact beneficial to use it for enhanced oil recovery if that's what it takes for it to stay alive. I wish we just had so many private buyers that they didn't have to, but like we don't.
Because you still see even a lot of private buyers, especially non-American, are quite allergic to the idea of DAC potentially ending up for EOR, right? And we, again, non-American perspective maybe, but there's also a lot of fear that the heavy use in EOR, like in Stratos, will kind of taint the reputation of DAC for carbon removal more broadly. Is this something you're seeing play out as well? And or what can we do about it? Because that's definitely something that DAC is struggling with.
Yeah, I tend to think that I know those concerns are real. I just don't actually see them materializing in the real life in any markets, in any economics. Like the argument has never really made sense to me. One, um, I think some of the disagreement is around like theories of change. My own theory of change is that uh, oil and gas, tech, mining, right? Like these are some of the most important, consequential, and politically powerful entities on planet Earth across every geography that they exist. Um, and so direct air capture is obviously something that the oil and gas industry is a fan of, not just because of its use for EOR, but because it is very similar to things that they've been doing. I mean, oil and gas companies are the best movers of atoms on the planet Earth, and DAC is much more akin to moving atoms that they're used to, through pipelines and underground than it is something like enhanced rock weathering or ocean alkalinity or any of the
Yeah.
other ways you could do CDR. And so, on the theory of change bit, like I just believe that oil and gas mining and, the tech industry, which now has more of an overlap with oil and gas due to their energy demand, are going to be around for 100 years to some extent. And the fact that they are interested in doing something on climate like this and want to put investment towards it is good. And I've already laid out the case for EOR. And so I just don't, and just like simple economics, like EOR is more expensive to do. DAC is probably the most expensive form of CDR. So you're not going to get widespread DAC EOR that induces demand for oil in the market. Like that, just the numbers do not pencil out. I don't see how that happens.
Yeah, that's my feeling too. And I just see a comment as well here in the chat that DAC plus EOR 100% greenwashing in the comment. But basically talking about the costs, right? Like if you're going to do EOR, why would you combine it with DAC? Doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, which kind of preempts a lot of the concerns, I guess, that you hear.
Yeah, well, you have to believe that the price of CO2 is going to be baked into oil at some point in the future. And that's like Vicky's whole thesis, is that in the future, the embedded emissions of oil are going to be baked into the cost of the oil, and CO2 EOR with direct air capture is a way to produce incredibly low carbon intensive barrels of oil.
Yeah.
And again, something I know we're close to time here, but just would wrap up with saying is, if any climate tech is going to scale, brimstone, thermal batteries, all of that, I've seen all of the the techno-economic analyses on these things, they all rely on incredibly cheap power and heat, which is exactly what DAC relies on. So whether you want DAC to get cheap or thermal batteries to get cheap or any of this stuff, it all comes
relies on the
back
same assumption.
yeah, it all comes back to cheap power and heat. And so in the world where we do have decreased demand from alternatives like thermal batteries, it will also make DAC cheaper, which again is great for things like enhanced oil recovery while we're using barrels of oil or just for dedicated storage.
Where I land after this conversation, which is kind of reinforcing what I thought, was ETSs and especially CBAMs are just so important to get us into this direction, right? And it's going to be so hard. We're seeing so much resistance, especially to CBAMs. They have so many geopolitical implications. We're going to have a lot of countries trying to water them down. But as you said, we need to bake the cost of carbon into the barrel of oil. Otherwise, a lot of the things that you mentioned are just not going to take off.
Yep, absolutely. And I would just encourage everyone, like truly, I have found a lot of value in my life as a person who wants to reduce emissions and get to net zero as fast as possible. Go read the public disclosures of oil and gas companies and what they say in their quarterly reports on their plans and what they're doing and the costs of things. I think it's highly instructive to understand how much it costs to do things. What is, the thing that they're producing? What is that currently being sold for on the market? What are the alternatives that use or don't use fossil fuels? And think about like, how do we actually reduce emissions as fast as possible? Where are the low-hanging fruits in all sectors, not just power and transport, which everybody loves to talk about. Think about it in industry, which includes oil and gas, because as we started this conversation, we could be using 24 million barrels a day of oil and gas in 2050 net zero, and we should want those to be as low carbon intensive as possible.
Excellent. Jack, thank you so much. Really love this conversation. Also, thank you for everyone online. I saw some people were very active, and I hope we managed to address a lot of the points you mentioned. And hopefully we can decarbonize oil and gas as fast as possible. Thanks, Jack.
Yeah.
Have a good rest of your day.
Yep. See you.
Bye.